When people think about early British puppet television, one name tends to come up again and again: Gerry Anderson. And with good reason. His work would go on to define what television world building looks like: structured, controlled, internally consistent. But that isn't where things started, because before those worlds became systems, they were something else entirely. They were stories. And one of the people working in that earlier form was someone who is now almost completely absent from the conversation: Roberta Leigh. Roberta Leigh didn't come into television as an engineer or a technician or a builder of productions. She came into it as a writer. Her instincts were literary. Narrative came first. Character came first. The medium was something to be used, not something to be engineered. And that distinction shapes everything that follows. One of her best known creations is Torchy the Battery Boy. At first glance, it's simple: a children's puppet series, modest in scale, clearly aimed at a young audience. But structurally, it tells you exactly how Leigh understands television. Each episode is self-contained, character-led, and morally clear. The world exists, but only in service of the story being told in that moment. It doesn't need to extend beyond the episode. It doesn't need to suggest a wider infrastructure. It just needs to support the narrative. That's a very different starting point from what television would later become. Because this approach has a natural limit. As soon as you try to expand the scale, to move into something like science fiction, the question changes. It's no longer just, what is the story? It becomes, what is the world this story takes place in? And that's where things begin to shift. In 1960, Leigh created Space Patrol. This is a significant step. The setting expands, the scope widens. There are recurring elements, a sense, however loose, that this is a world rather than just a series of situations. But crucially, it still isn't a fully constructed world. The episodes remain largely self-contained. The world exists, but it doesn't yet govern the storytelling. It's still, fundamentally, story first. And this is where things become particularly interesting, because Space Patrol is also where Leigh's work intersects with that of Gerry Anderson. Anderson and his team were involved in the production. So for a brief moment, you have two very different approaches to television occupying the same space. Not in opposition or conflict, just both present. That moment reveals that there isn't just one way to solve the problem of television. There are at least two. Leigh's approach is story-led, episodic, and author-driven. The world is flexible. It adapts to the needs of each story. Anderson's approach, which would become clearer in later work, is system-led, continuity-driven, and production-shaped. The world is fixed. It exists independently, and the stories operate within it. After Space Patrol, those two approaches don't merge, they separate. Anderson continues to develop what becomes a highly controlled, internally consistent model of television world building. Leigh continues with a model rooted in story and authorship. There's no dramatic break required here, no need to overstate it. It's simply that television, as a medium, begins to move in one direction more than the other. Over time, one of those approaches becomes dominant. The idea of television as a constructed world becomes the standard. Rules, continuity, and internal logic all must apply. And because of that, the earlier model becomes harder to see, not because it failed, but because it didn't define what came next. Roberta Leigh's work represents something quite specific, a moment when television had not yet decided what it was going to be, when a world could still be flexible, responsive, and shaped entirely by the needs of a story, rather than something that existed in its own right. It's tempting to think of this as a stepping stone, a precursor to something more developed, but that's not quite right. It's better understood as an alternative, a different way television might have evolved if different priorities had taken hold. So before television worlds became the environment, they were the stories. And before those environments were fully built, people like Roberta Leigh were already working in that space, not as a footnote and not as a precursor, but as someone solving the same problem in a completely different way. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that. I will be back on another day with another television show. Thank you. Bye.